Coming up on Cracking Quantum.
Essentially, I look at the processes of how science goes from lab to market. My sort of argument that I'm making is I think we're running the risk of going into a quantum winter because of the way we're talking about it right now. And if we're not able to fulfill on those expectations, we run the risk of it not being well-resourced, well-funded, well-supported publicly. You'd think it's quite a simple thing to define hype, but what I found when I wrote a book about hype is actually it's more complicated than that, and everybody seems to have slightly different ideas around what it is and whether it's good or bad.
My name's Ash Lyons. Join me as I try and figure out what quantum science is really all about. Welcome to Cracking Quantum. So, as I was saying earlier, I was doing my due diligence, like a good little podcast host, and I was having a look at your website.
Okay.
It said that you're learning to fly.
Oh, out of date. Well, I was out of date. I need to update my website. Thank you for the reminder. Yeah, I did start learning to fly, actually, and I definitely am keen to get back to it. Yeah, I randomly decided to pick up lessons down when I was living in London. I thought it would be a good hobby. It turns out a very expensive hobby.
Oh yeah, I bet.
Like super expensive. They caught me on like an entry deal of like first couple of lessons was like half price. And then it ranked up. But oh, it's amazing. Yeah, I don't know. I've always been fascinated by, I love being on planes.
Yeah.
Always love being in planes. And I don't know, I just think, what a cool hobby. Oh yeah, I'm just like a random pilot in my spare time.
That'd be amazing. I think everybody kind of like has that dream in the background, right?
Yeah.
Learning to fly.
And you can do it. Why not? I actually had tried to join the air squadron when I was in uni, purely to learn to fly. I have no interest in like military. But they paid for your flying lessons, or I think they paid for like half of the lessons you need in order to get a pilot's license. But they didn't take me, so hey ho.
Oh, well, it was worth a try.
But no, it's still a dream, and it'll still happen. I've got all the textbooks, so they're just sitting at home waiting to be reread. After it's been about 4 years since I last flew. So, yeah,
That's still not too long though.
No, I think I probably will have to start a little bit. Well, I don't know. I mean, the thing that I actually found the hardest to overcome was I kept getting really, like, I was going to say car sick, but I guess plane sick.
Oh yeah, I get that. So there's I live quite close to Loch Lomond, and there's a seaplane. And for kind of like as a mini honeymoon trip, me and my wife took a trip over to Jura. So one of the islands.
Lovely.
It's only like less than an hour flight over, even in one of these little seaplanes. And I never get sick on planes, but I sat in the back of this thing. It's just like I'm turning a bit green.
Same. I mean, I get really bad car sick. I always have, but I've never felt ill on a plane, even when it's like super turbulent. But no, I think. Well, I guess you're more turbulent in a small plane than you are in a jetliner. But yeah, they told me I should have. The instructor I had was like, you need to have ginger crystals. So I used to, and I hate them. Like I like ginger biscuits, but ginger crystals are minging. So I'd be sitting on the tube from my flat to my lesson, like popping these ginger crystals to try and not feel quite so. It never worked actually. But then one of the other instructors was like, "Oh, your instructor's a bit new age. Like just get normal pills. Like you don't need to have ginger." I was like, I've had so many lessons having to have all this ginger, and it like doesn't work anyway.
Yeah, that alone is not worth it to me. I hate ginger. It's one of those things that I just
so horrible. I can't get on with. Like chewy, minging, not nice. Anyway, so.
Well, thank you for joining me for the podcast.
No worries.
I'm joined today by Gemma Milne. Your CV is going to take a while to go through.
It's also difficult to decipher. I find most people don't understand what I do.
But it's good. You've got like such a diverse breadth of experience. So you were a journalist previously. You wrote about science and technology. You've got publications in things like Forbes, The Guardian, the BBC, Wired. I don't know if there's any other big names that I'm missing there.
No, you've probably covered it. Probably a few others.
I think that's enough, right?
That's fine. That's plenty.
Now you're a lecturer at Glasgow, whilst also just about finishing your PhD, you were saying. So your lecturer position is in
I'm a lecturer in innovation and technology management in the business school.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, it's glorious. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit talking about quantum, but essentially I look at the processes of how science goes from lab to market and how it's managed into existence, as I like to say.
Yeah. Does that relate to your PhD? Because you're doing your PhD at Edinburgh, is that right?
Funnily enough, not really. Well, depends. You could kind of, sociology, everything's related. My PhD's in sociology, and I look at corporate futurism. So basically I look at these professionals of various kinds who go into large corporates and sell so-called corporate foresight or scenario planning services. And I essentially look at that as a market and as a product and kind of how they turn the future into a decision-making corporate tool, essentially.
Cool.
So you can kind of talk about lab to market. They're taking the ideas of, a lot of sociology theories around how we should try and reimagine utopias and whatnot, and then turn it into, they do tech transfer into the market, arguably, but it's a bit of a stretch.
And maybe the last thing that we should mention is you have a book as well.
Yes.
So your book is called Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It.
That's the one.
That's an excellent lead into what I want to talk with you about today, which is all around hype. Because, this is your jam, right? This is what you know.
Yes.
And there's obviously, at least from my side, a huge amount of hype around quantum and what it means, because we see it everywhere. It's in TV shows, it's in films, it's all over science fiction. Usually I have like a big list of questions that I try and prepare before I go into these, but there's only two really that I wanted to ask you, and I think we could spend the rest of the podcast talking about these.
Perfect.
So the first one is, do you think that quantum in itself is overhyped? So is it going to be, is it not going to be delivering everything that we're promising? So as in, are we trying to say that quantum is going to be bigger than it actually is? And the other one, which is kind of connected to this, is how does that actually compare to the rest of science and technology? Because we see a lot of hype all over the place.
Yeah, definitely. The answer is it depends, which is always the answer when you ask these kind of questions. But I think the thing with quantum and hype is that the promise or the potential of quantum, I don't think, is necessarily overhyped. I think that we have enough evidence and enough investment and interest and progress being made that suggests that quantum is big and is going to be impactful and does have the potential to change the way we do things in healthcare and energy and communications and finance and all these different places. But the thing that's, I would say, important when we think about hype that often gets missed is that ultimately hype in and of itself is constructive of what ends up happening. So if we overhype things and the sort of expectations get mismanaged, sometimes that ends up meaning that the thing doesn't end up delivering because investment is pulled or because things get pushed in different directions. And if we underhype, as it were, you're then not getting enough resources to realize the potential of things. So hype, I sort of see as the engine as to whether something is realized in particular ways. That's a sort of very broad strokes way of talking about it. And when you're talking about comparing with other areas, AI is obviously the area that most commonly gets talked about when we talk about hype. And for anyone who's kind of read about AI hype before, you'll know that AI has gone through what we talk about as winters, various AI winters, right? And what's happened is, people get very excited about the technology. There's really high expectations. For some reason or other, those expectations get fail. And then the interest and the investment, the infrastructure and the public buy-in reduces. And then you end up in this phase of winter. So in the book, the chapter that I have on quantum talks about my sort of argument that I'm making is I think we're running the risk of going into a quantum winter because of the way we're talking about it right now. And if we're not able to fulfill on those expectations, and we can talk a bit more about what we mean by that, we run the risk of it not being well-resourced, well-funded, well-supported publicly, and thus potentially not being able to do what we hope it would do as the sort of more basic aligned researchers and people with interest in kind of the social good outcomes of quantum as opposed to the kind of just business ones.
Yeah, that absolutely makes a lot of sense. So essentially there is an element where we need hype to kind of build up expectation and to really get people, and people can mean not just general public, but also the funders, the people who are actually going to allow us to do the research. We need their backing to do anything. So of course we need to get people excited.
Yeah, I mean, hype is a tool for attention grabbing, right? That's you'd think it's quite a simple thing to define hype, but what I found when I wrote a book about hype is actually it's more complicated than that, and everybody seems to have slightly different ideas around what it is and whether it's good or bad. But what I sort of landed on is that it's a tool for attention grabbing. It doesn't do anything more than that. It doesn't actually convey sort of core information about a thing. All it does is it conveys us that the person who's telling you about it needs you to be excited by it. That's what it conveys. So, and we need attention for lots of different things. I mean, people talk about us living in this so-called attention economy. We need attention for not just getting money for our businesses or funding for our research, but people overhype their CV to get a job. You also hype up your mates if you want people to, give them money for their GoFundMe or whatever. We use hype in so many different ways. And of course, in the world of branding and fashion, hype is very much, and music, it's much more seen as a more positive force around, lifting up things that should be lifted up. So yeah, it's absolutely needed. And actually, I think one of the things that I've been talking a lot more recently, there's a sort of creation of this critical hype studies discipline within the social sciences, is kind of being a lot more reflective, particularly as researchers, but also writers and people who put out messages about things, of your kind of role as a hype producer and a hype, as well as a hype audience member, as it were.
There's a point in that I wanted to touch on at least briefly, and that's that actually from my side, what I see is that most scientists, and particularly young scientists, or people who are just starting their career, are really quite humble a lot of the time. I think it's partly to do with how we write scientific literature. Everything is a group effort, and you very need to carefully stick to not over-promising. You need to be factual about everything that you're saying. But then when you try and put those same researchers into a situation where they do need to hype a little bit, and I think the thing that triggered this in my head is when you're talking about people writing their CVs. So when we have young researchers who are applying for their first grants, their first fellowships and things, it's really hard to get them into the mindset of really selling themselves like anybody else would, I think.
Absolutely.
Really trying to push the boundaries of saying, look at what I'm doing, it's amazing, versus the usually quite humble approach of, we did this and that, and we found this interesting thing, but it tends to be a little bit underplayed.
Definitely, and I've seen that across researchers as a whole. I mean, I think previously when I was more in my journalism role, I was spending a lot of time with researchers who maybe I'd received a press release from Central University about what they were doing, and then I'd go, great, let me have an interview, and I'd speak to them, and I'd be going, okay, but why does this matter? But why does this matter? No, but seriously, why does this matter? And it was having to really drag these ideas out of people, and I completely understand why, and I actually really appreciate that hesitation to overhype. I think that's, I mean, frankly, we're all aware of the scientists and the researchers who do overhype, right? They're the ones ultimately with the big labs, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there's an element of it's good to be hesitant in that respect. But at the same time, I think it also comes from a space of, we talk about public engagement, we talk about the importance of impact and so on and so forth in sort of science and university settings. But I think it's a bit more than that. I think it's about a responsibility to, at the end of the day, explain why you're excited about something and why you're passionate about something, particularly when ultimately you're publicly funded, right?
Yeah.
And we're privileged to get to do this kind of work. So, I don't think it's overhyping to explain why you get up in the morning and why you find something worthwhile doing. And that was always how we ended up framing the question. I was like, can you just tell me why you like coming to work? I mean, sometimes they're like, I've got good colleagues. I'm like, okay, not useful. But, I think it's sometimes saying, why does this matter is a much more difficult question to answer than why is this interesting? But it's important, and it's it's required at the end of the day.
Yeah, you raise this point that a lot of people tend to fall back on around public funding. As in, I mean, that's ultimately what is funding most of the research. That's, at least in the UK, that's what is making most of it happen. So yeah, it's absolutely true. We have an obligation to tell the public what it is that we're doing, but it's still missing this kind of like huge component of, well, if you as a scientist are not excited about what you're doing, if you don't have hype, why are you doing it?
Yeah. I think there's also something else that is worth mentioning here too, is that, and this comes back to this point around hype being, we talk about hype being a self-fulfilling prophecy or being generative or, co-constructing realities and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, if we're not hyping, for lack of a word, or we're not being able to contextualize why we are undertaking things as a society in the language of why it's important for a public investor, a taxpayer, if you will. The arguments around value shift to who's going to listen. And what I mean by that is the arguments around value shift to the world of business, right? So at the end of the day, if we're not talking about value in the public realm, where else do we look for value? Well, we look at it from the private markets. And we're seeing that in quantum. That's one of the big arguments that I made in the chapter, is that I sort of see a capturing of quantum hype in this, how do we make it relevant for business space? And my worry there is that, investors, businesses, they want quite short-term return. That is not the reality of quantum research, as you well know. And I worry that that's exactly, this is what happens with AI. It's what's happened with other technologies. The expectations ultimately are financial, right? It's like, why are we not getting return? Why are we not getting this business that you promised us? Why are we not getting this application that was meant to come and create this machine that we could sell or whatever? And then the resources start to dwindle, right? So I find that when there's not this focus on creating a more general public discussion around the value of doing things in science that result in enterprise that doesn't have to be supermarket capitalism enterprise, it can be other forms of organizational enterprise that can create real things in the world, the attention goes to making the hype work within a business space, because ultimately they're the ones who listen and are giving money. So it's not just a case of going, this is taxpayers' money and we need to justify why we get to do a cool job. It's also going, if we don't make this important and we don't make this something that people care about as a voter, as a citizen, as somebody who reads the news, as somebody who cares about what we as a society do, science gets captured by the market. And we know that. We see that in so many areas of science. And my hope is that doesn't happen to the same degree with quantum, but it's running the risk of doing that right now.
I'm going to ask you a slightly leading question, because I think...
Because you're not a sociologist, you're a physicist at the end of the day. We're not allowed to do that.
I think I know the answer, but I wanted to at least ask you before I start talking about it. Is there an area within quantum where this is particularly prevalent, where this is happening? Is there like a subcategory within quantum where we see a lot of this?
The short answer is I don't know is the short answer. And I think a lot of time hype is quite hard to discern until slightly after the fact. I would say that I think there's particular flavors of hype within quantum, one of which is definitely linked to AI, right? This idea of the science is all wrong in the way it's described, but it's basically saying, if you have a quantum computer, you can do better computation because you can do multiple calculations at once, and that's what you need for AI to work even better than it possibly can, right?
Sure.
And it rides the same train as AI hype, and what it also does is kind of adds this sort of level of depth. Like, you can do real AI, you can do big AI, you can do even ever more complicated AI, right? And there's obviously levels of truth to that with various areas of quantum machine learning and so on and so forth. But I would say that's very much the same kind of world of hype, as it were. The other area that I see kind of issues in, and again, this comes back to a sort of existing way of explaining things and not necessarily, being true to what it is the way we talk about qubits and this idea of like counting the qubits. They've done this many qubits, they've done that many qubits, so on and so forth. And there's this, and I think the part of the reason that captures people is, frankly, it's really easy to understand. It's really easy to understand this has more than that, so it must be better.
Yeah,
right?
It's a very easy metric. It's just
so easy.
This number is bigger, therefore it's better.
And it's like a complete, as you will know far more than I will, it's not a measure of the quality necessarily of what's being done, right? There's a reason that we need more qubits, and there's a reason that we need to build ever more complicated forms of computation and hardware and so on and so forth. But just counting qubits, and what we've seen is in the past, companies, D-Wave being the kind of standard example of riding that wave of, I mean, they didn't even have real qubits, right? But they rode the wave of media hype around counting qubits, and it did become a self-fulfilling prophecy. They got a lot of investment, a lot of interest, a lot of very large investors, very large customers buying these machines, right? And ultimately that money then went into developing something that, I understand is semi-useful now, right? So I would say I would say there's hype around how press releases and the media kind of announce new advancements in quantum. And I think a lot of that is tied to, it's too complicated to describe it properly, so let's just say how many qubits Google has done, or let's just say how many qubits IBM has done, or whatever, like that's easy. So those are the two areas that I see the most, at least public hype. The rest of the stuff I think doesn't even make it out into the public writ large, as it were.
Yeah, that actually leads in excellently to the point that I was going to make, because when I was kind of insinuating, I kind of think I know what you're going to say to this question. What I was really thinking is there's a lot of hype around quantum computing specifically, and almost to the point where people think of these two things almost synonymously. You've got quantum, so that means quantum computing. There's so much more to quantum that's out there, but it tends to be these tiny little things that trickle through and sometimes don't become immediately obvious in the public eye. I don't work in quantum computing at all. I do imaging and sensing, and it tends to be that we can create a new type of microscope that uses quantum effects or something, but it's less catchy for the public, so it tends to fly a little bit under the radar.
I would disagree. I went to your Brain Arc conference. You did this conference in partnership with the Brain Lot, and the Quantum Lot came together. And, sitting there in the room as a researcher, but as an ex-journalist, I was like, geez, there are so many stories here. I was thinking, if there's a journalist in this room, easy, you've got at least 10 articles out of the idea of being able to image a brain. Everybody loves hearing about imaging a brain.
Of course.
That's look Open Wired, and you will probably, almost every edition, there's something about the brain. Don't understand the brain. If only we could see more of the brain, or understand, it's like, that is a catchy story. And health in general does tend to capture people, because of course it's so easy to relate that to yourself, someone the very idea of longevity or health or disease, So I think that's where there's potential, but also risk with hype, because then when you're starting to, great, we can use a microscope that can image things in a new way, but it uses this thing called quantum that nobody can really fully explain. And it does the exact same tropes of how we try and describe these things over and over again. And I think sometimes maybe there's a moment in quantum at the moment where we are starting to see more tangible applications becoming reality, at least within a research setting, that allows us to talk about it through things like imaging the brain, or being able to scan things that we couldn't scan before. These sorts of ideas that are very easy to explain. I mean, think about it. A lot of science journalism doesn't actually go into real depths of the science, right? It's far more focused on the application or the process of discovery or whatnot.
Which is kind of, that's how it should be, right? Because people aren't going to be able to take in the science, because it requires a certain level of background to really get to grips.
Or it's just going to have to be a really long article. I mean,
exactly.
There's a reality to, if you skim across the surface, you're inevitably going to miss something. And if you don't, if you're not sort of entitled to the attention for someone beyond 500 words, then you really do have to shorten it. And I mean, I think there's something to be said about and where like Smoke and Mirrors kind of ended on what I really wanted to do with that book was about going, this is not about just dispelling hype. It's not just about making an enemy of hype. What it is about trying to be able to uncover the idea that hype is used to capture attention about particular things. And now that it's got your attention, and now you're able to, hopefully with the help of the book, navigate it a little bit more, you can now engage as a member of the public. That's the point. And I think sometimes, you know, when we're talking about applications of science, we don't give enough information for people to feel empowered to engage, or we give it way too detailed that it's not possible to actually go, well, hang on a second, why does this matter? And it doesn't strike this balance of going, what is it we're actually, why are we even telling people about this? Why is it important for people to know? I mean, obviously with health stuff, a lot of the time it's, you know, advocacy, but on a research stage, it's not. I mean, we're not at the point of doing these things yet. So is it just interest? I mean, I think it's got to be more than that.
There's a really nice parallel here with semiconductors and electronics, I think, because there's so much research that goes into the background. But of course, we don't tell the general public like every tiny little advancement, because it requires way too much explanation to be able to get there. It's probably not going to be that interesting because you can't go directly into the applications. So a lot of that work tends to fly under the public radar. And then when it emerges in like the latest advancement in smartphone technology or something, of course it becomes public.
Yes.
And I think we're kind of at the risk with a lot of things in quantum where we're trying to do the opposite a little bit. So we try and sell this new quantum thing to capture the people's attention. And it tends to be represented in a way which isn't always matching up to the reality that you have as a scientist. Like you see these articles all the time with some like grand claim in the headline. And as a scientist, you look at it and you go, okay, then. Yeah, I mean, it's probably not doing exactly what you're saying. It's probably, or it's pushing the very limits of being true, but really trying to generate excitement. I guess this is leading into a question, is there a danger of doing that?
I mean, in answer to your question, I think it's worth mentioning my own journey and why I've ended up as a sociologist, frankly.
Please go for it.
From being, I mean, my undergrad was maths. I started maths and physics, but I dropped the physics. I just didn't like the lab. I just wanted theory, and they wouldn't give me that to
we
third
heard that
year.
a lot as physicists. That's fine.
They made me stay in the lab, and I was like, I can't wait 3 years. So no, sorry. But anyway, so I've always had a deep interest in this idea of communicating science. And I think a lot of people who like science, who are scientists, who are aligned with science in some way, have this urge to get other people excited about what they do, whether or not they actually engage with that as a writer, or whether they just try and get their pals to be excited about their work, whatever. There's this sort of sense of like, I think this is super interesting and super cool and super impactful for the world, and I want other people to know about it. And I think
no idea what you're talking about. I mean, I would never start a podcast.
Right, exactly. So this urge is there, and it's real, and it's valid, and all those sorts of things. My own journey of then going, right, I'm going to pursue that, right? I'm going to, I went and did other jobs, ended up in kind of innovation roles, so actually trying to work with this sort of startups to make things happen and whatnot, and then go, no, I think it makes more sense for me to be in comms because I can get these messages out. And as I kind of went through that journey, a lot of what I realized was like, I think just talking about the science is not enough for people who are not in the industry to be able to engage with it effectively. And what I mean by that is, I actually think it's quite important that people who are not quantum physicists and quantum scientists have a say in how we do quantum research, right? And a lot of people would be like, what? No, like, what does that, the people being the researchers is going, why do we need the public? Like, it's just research funding, like, it doesn't impact them yet.
Yeah.
And the public are going, I don't understand anything about that, why would I? But my view over these years is going, actually, the way that we conduct research now has huge impacts on the ultimate applications and the ultimate impact that it has on people later on down the line. So what you said there about we either talk about it at this really early stage or we talk about it at this really late stage. By the time you're saying, oh, look, you've got a quantum computer on your phone, whatever, you're also going to have articles critiquing that, going, hang on a second, this doesn't work the way that we want it, or hang on a second, this one company's got monopoly dominance on these phones that have quantum computers in them, right? And that has happened over a course of time of that. This is why I now research lab to market processes, right? Because I'm interested in everything that happens between those two articles that you essentially spoke about. And for me, when I'm thinking about what it means to communicate science to the public, I want them to know what the debates are within the field, because those debates are not normally scientific. They're also political and economic at the same time, right? And ultimately that has impact on the direction of development. And that's exactly what I was saying earlier about, if you think about hype at the moment around quantum, a lot of the attention around communicating quantum is going to businesses, right? I applied for some funding for your scheme last year, and because I was doing a project to do with finance companies in Scotland, and it made sense to do a project with quantum and finance because those areas make sense at the moment.
Yeah, it's one of the things that it's easily imaginable that a quantum computer is going to be useful for is the finance sector.
Absolutely. Do I think that that's how I want to spend all my time? No, because I'm not necessarily wanting to just elevate the financial industry through quantum, right? I think that there's other important things that we need to be doing in lieu of that, but it's arguably a very good way of getting funding into basic researchers to try and push things forward, right? That's my kind of pragmatist brain coming in. But equally, what that unearths and what that shows you is a sort of, well, where is the money going here? And how are we framing the potential of these technologies? And who is getting to make decisions about where development happens beyond the public realm of research funding, which, yes, starts things, but doesn't always see it through, right? The private markets is what ultimately, at the very end of the day, sort of does a lot of the translation, built on years and years and years, and lots of money of public funding.
So in other words, we do the fundamental research in the universities first, and then that gets funneled into companies, either through large companies commercializing or spin-outs, whatever.
Spin-outs from the universities. And I'm not saying, oh, that's terrible, Like, we need various different vehicles to make things real in the world, right? And businesses is one of those. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, if we don't have a broader conversation with more people who have differing interests, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the vast majority of people who work in quantum and who work in universities are of a particular sort of level of social capital, right?
Yeah.
Without this broader conversation, we are, I believe, run the risk of kind of cementing certain kinds of power structures and ultimately not always getting that potential of the technology at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We only have to look at the space industry. Who's the biggest funder of space right now? Defense.
Yeah.
Is that really what we want? Do we want rockets or do we want missiles? Like, I think there's something there about, like, there's a lot of different things happening within this big journey from lab to reality. And I think we do a disservice by not communicating the kind of all of that. And that's why I became a sociologist, because I needed to understand that better, basically.
Yeah. So just as like a final point along that line, is it a good step? Is it useful that we're getting the likes of SpaceX and Amazon to really kind of like take that final thing and push things forward? Because obviously, like things like space exploration were taking a bit of a dive in terms of public interest and funding until they came along and really pushing things forward. Yeah. Is that the kind of thing that we need for quantum? Do we need the big businesses to really be taking the quantum computing forward and turning it into something practical and usable?
We have that already,
that's
right?
True.
We have that already with IBM. We have that with Google. We have that with even some sort of smaller startup companies that have been acquired and are now quite large in the kind of quantum space. So I'm not against any businesses doing anything in quantum. I don't think that's realistic in terms of how our society is currently structured, right? Like, pragmatically, this is what is required in order for things to become material, right, in the world.
I guess that's really the question I'm trying to ask. Is it a good thing, but is this the way that we need to do it these days? Because otherwise, it kind of becomes science for the sake of science, and not necessarily, if it's not in the public eye, it's not necessarily going to have the drive and the public funding to be able to take it forward. Right.
And a lot of my current work around this political economy of lab to market is focused on what are the alternatives to lab to market. If lab to market is this kind of accepted norm, right? There's no other way. How else do you get science out? You have to go lab to market. Well, do we? Or surely it's, you know, I mean, in sociology we talk a lot about imaginaries and, you know, the idea of money is not real. You know, it's a social construction, right? So like, well, maybe lab to market is a social construction. Maybe all of these kind of infrastructures and schemes that we have around, say, science entrepreneurship shouldn't be the only way. What if you're a scientist and you would like to make your stuff material? You had other options than just walking down the road to the tech transfer office at the university. What if there was another way of doing things? And increasingly there are other alternatives, but I think within deep tech as a collective term, but within quantum specifically, and specifically quantum because it's like a sort of immature market versus the likes of space, it is very difficult to, it's hard enough to try and work out how to make things real in the world. But I think, I mean, a lot of the kind of project of my work is looking at what can we learn from other sort of spaces, you know, what could a cooperative business model mean for a quantum enterprise, or what would public IP mean for photonics, right? These kind of ideas that are sort of seen as a bit weird and kind of don't really make sense within the deep tech world. Well, why not? And I think that isn't about saying this is the one way of doing things or this is the right way and that's the wrong way. I think it's about saying, actually, if the goal is to make science material, we don't only have to do it one way. And we already know we have so many examples of that one way being harmful. I mean, you only have to look at pharma and the root of biotech to see where we do have issues, right? So we don't want to fall. Quantum, I think we've got a huge opportunity. It's early. We've not got status quo ways of doing things in quantum yet. So there's a huge opportunity to go, actually, we really do want, you know, quantum technologies to be able to enhance how we do energy loading in our grid or whatever. That's actually what we really want. What we don't want is a company to buy a particular research group, have market dominance around energy loading, and then they create a company that does energy loading better than anyone else and they capture a market, right? Do we want that? Or do we want public energy that actually everybody can access and afford, powered by quantum? I mean, that's obviously a very hypey idea. But the point I'm making is like we have an opportunity to do things differently, and that's what gets me up in the morning. That's my hypey answer if a journalist was to ask me the question.
Just touching finally on some of the points out, we do see things work in different ways for really large scale projects, so the likes of CERN, gravitational wave detectors, things like that. So we know that there's other ways of this working that don't rely on lab to markets. Absolutely.
And I completely agree. And I think that's exactly, what is missed in a lot of the narratives at the moment around, you know, there's a real focus on spinning out. There's a real, I mean, you probably get emails about this from the university.
All the time.
Right? You know, come to Science Entrepreneurship Club, or come learn how to build your entrepreneurship skills, or come learn how to do IP licensing, or come learn how to write a business model or marketing, so on and so forth. Like there's a current culture around this. And again, not saying that as all bad or all terrible or whatever. I think there are a lot of great schemes in that space, and it is some really good work that is being done.
And the right technologies, it is going to be the right path. There's lots for sure in optics and photonics, strongly related to quantum, that really are just going to be like, I can make this little device and I'm going to sell it to XYZ. That's could potentially be the perfect opportunity to spin out.
Perfect. Could be. If, for instance, a person is, you know, wants to be a CEO and wants to have equity and ownership of something and wants to have control, right? I mean, you can choose other ways. So I think that's where my concern comes in, is that I think that there's a level of like cementing this idea of spinning out, and because it's in quite a lot of people's interests, universities being one of them, particularly in a current climate where they need to find other ways of finding income, and a really good way of finding income is to take equity in companies that spin out from their labs, right? It's like a really, frankly, not simple process, but a simple idea in terms of being able to bring an income stream in. So, you know, it makes sense, right?
It's almost definitely not a coincidence that we see a few universities starting to struggle financially and an increased push to be spinning out companies.
Right, exactly. Equally, there is, you know, absolutely fair and correct critique that without tech transfer offices, there is an element of work being squandered, right? So there's arguments for and against, and there's no one way or right way. But yeah, I think what you said about the fact that there are alternatives and that there are other ways, and we have precedent for other ways of doing things, is something that I think needs to be a lot higher in the agenda, right? And maybe it's just the circles that I'm in. You know, I spend a lot of time in these kind of deep tech entrepreneurship circles. So, but what I'm seeing in there is this real cementation, if that's a word, cementing of a norm. Yeah. And but you know, you mentioned CERN. You know, there's spin outs from CERN. You know, they still go through lab to market. They have a tech transfer facility there, right? So but I agree, there's other ways to make things real in the world, which is ultimately what we're all trying to do here, right? Yeah.
Just to finish off, because I don't want to keep you too long, do you have a random science fact?
Oh yes, a random science fact. Okay, so I recently learned, although probably other people have not recently learned because there's a lot of media about octopuses / octopi. We were talking earlier, we didn't know the plural of octopus.
I'm not sure anybody knows. I think there's like
maybe
5
they're like
different
sheep.
answers.
Maybe it's just octopus. Anyway, but I found out that they have like a mini brain in each of their tentacles.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so seemingly they have 9 brains. They have one that's like, I guess, a regular, well, no, what's regular? A brain that's in between their eyes, like kind of similar to us. And then each of their tentacles, I don't know if they're actual brains or this is, again, media spin where they've called them brains, because that makes sense. But anyway, seemingly they have like little brains or tentacles. And I don't know, I find that really compelling, the idea of like, imagine all your fingers and toes had their own.
Oh, that sounds scary.
Yeah, it's kind of like,
terrifying.
Imagine your fingers were all doing different things. No, that's weird. But anyway, I thought that was I was thinking about it quite a lot after I read it and how amazing that is. I feel like we're only just scratching the surface of octopuses. Seems to be a lot of books about octopuses at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. There's lots going on with octopuses or whatever.
Yeah, and they have 3 hearts as well. They have 3 hearts for like turning they have like, oh God, I'm going to get this totally wrong. Something about they have blue blood. They're blue-blooded creatures.
Oh yeah,
and
that
so
much I remember.
Seemingly 2 of the hearts like process the blood to oxygenate it in some such way to make it more efficient to travel round to their mini brains. And so then they have a heart that is like, I guess, the red blood heart or whatever. Oh God, this is a terrible practice of an ex-science journalist. Anyway, but yes, they have multiple brains, multiple hearts, multiple legs. What's not to love?
Yeah. There's so much information there. It always amazes me what we don't know about whatever the hell is living in the sea, because it's one of the seems like the great unknowns that we still have not explored properly.
God, I know.
We know more about the surface of the moon and Mars than we know about the bottom of the ocean.
I know, isn't that amazing? Yeah, I've also found there's been some, coming back to my favourite, which is political economy of science. And technology. There's been some really amazing recent work around how the ocean and its science and technology that's related to the ocean, the kind of how that all works politically and through the economy and whatnot. There's been a lot of really interesting work around ownership of different seabeds and kind of how that relates to what we know about the ocean, how things move through the ocean, ships and so on and so forth, and how that kind of changes obviously things like trade and whatnot, but also discovery.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I find it's an area that I kind of dip into. Forgive the pun. Every now and again.
Pun is a good place to leave it, I think.
Love it. Love it.
Thank you very much, Gemma. That was really, really interesting. Thank you.
No
for your
worries.
time.
Thanks for having me.
You've reached the end of the podcast, which probably means that you enjoyed what you're listening to. So please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share this podcast series as much as you can. The more you do those things, the better this podcast is going to be. Don't forget, you can always contact me by email at ash@crackingquantum.co.uk. And please join me again for another episode of Cracking Quantum.